Okay, so in this video, I want to walk you through our required textbooks and our course schedule. And so I'm going to show you each of the textbooks and also talk briefly about them and the suggested texts as well. First, I'm going to show you Women's Indian Captivity by Mary Rowlandson. This is from the Penguin series of books. These books are usually really affordable and are very beneficial. I have a bunch of these on Kindle and I have a bunch in print. We are just going to look at the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, which is the first captivity narrative in this book. Another captivity narrative that you may want to read supplementally, if you wish, is Hannah Dunstan's that follows it. What a captivity narrative is it's an account of somebody who is taken captive by natives. The particular captivity of Mary Rowlandson took place during King Philip's War, which was the greatest, most devastating war that took place in the 17th century on in the colonial period in the British colonies. So this particular work will give you a good understanding of the savagery of living in the frontier and what it was like for the earliest colonists. We oftentimes think of New England as this very settled, sophisticated, almost Victorian-esque place. But when settlers first came to America, it was very much frontierland and it was dangerous and threatening. And this resource kind of helps us get a good grip and understanding on that. The second one is the collected works of Anne Bradstreet. So we're going to look at this for the entire second week of our class. Anne Bradstreet was one of the first settlers who came across the Atlantic. Her father became the second governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And she was the first woman poet to be published in America, and her works were really well celebrated. She what we're going to do is we're going in our first day of lectures look at a selection from her muse, which was her printed work that was published in London as a result of the work of her brother-in-law John Woodbridge. And then we're going to also look at her biographical writings. They're called the Andover manuscripts as well. And they're going to see a little bit more of the raw life of what it was like for early colonial settlers. The next work that we're going to look at in week 3 is David Brainerd's diary. David Brainerd was a young man who became a missionary to the natives in the 18th century. He lived from 1718 to 1747. He died in the home of Jonathan Edwards, and Jonathan Edwards was the editor of his diary and brought it to publication. David Brainerd's diary became maybe the most published and read American book during the mid 18th century up to the American Revolution. So it was a very significant and important work, and it's the work that most missionaries pointed to in the world missions movement as being a work that was effectual for them to get involved in world missions. Then in week 4, we're going to look at Sarah Osborne's collected writings. We're going to read her memoir, and we're also going to read a number of her letters that she wrote, which that's going to be another element to this class, is that we're going to read some significant correspondence literature, particularly in week 4 and in week 5 as well. And so Sarah Osborne was uh, a teacher who lived in Newport, Rhode Island. She was significant during the First Great Awakening and the later parts of the First Great Awakening, having revivals hosted in her home. She, alongside of Anne Bradstreet, they are the first and the second woman in colonial America to have writings published by them during their lifetime, which was a huge um, accomplishment during that time period. Then during our 5th week, we're going to look at Samson Occam. Samson Occam was a native pastor, and he was mentored by Eleazar Wheelock. He was involved in raising funds for Eleazar Wheelock's school, and so he traveled to London and spent uh, a significant amount of time raising funding for what became Andover Newton Seminary and College. His writings are very fascinating coming from a native standpoint because we can see some of the power differential between the white colonists and natives, and some of the uh, frustrations that he particularly experienced in trying to fit himself within the empire and within British colonial social graces and elitism, while also maintaining a sense of native culture as well, and also trying to protect and to fight for the rights of natives, especially their property rights in New England. And then the last person we're going to look at is Olidau Equiano. Olidau Equiano's personal narrative was very significant in bringing about British abolition of slavery. His account is really fascinating because sometimes people compare it closer to a fictional travel account like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels or Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And so he did some very fascinating things. He fought in the French and Indian War. He was involved in the American Revolution. And he also was part of the exploratory missions into the Arctic Circle, the attempts to cross the Arctic. And so also he was a very active sailor and navigator in the Caribbean. So we also get a good understanding of Caribbean trade and the whole slave trade. His earliest part of his account is an account of him being an African who is enslaved and survives the Middle Passage to the Caribbean. Okay, so I'll also briefly talk to you about our suggested works which you could do your research paper on. Of course, we have the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, one of our first founders of our nation. He was very significant for the Continental Congress and the development of our Constitution. He was also a significant ambassador and also an Enlightenment and uh, scientific experimenter and inventor. Of course, you probably remember the kite and key story about electricity with Benjamin Franklin. And so he's a very significant political and innovator and thinker for us to look at. Another significant person that we would have looked at was Harriet Newell. If you wish to do Harriet Newell's biography, we don't actually have a critical publication of her biography these days. It's a work that really needs to be done. But what we can do is you can access the original work through Google Play, and you can read her missionary account. She, along with her husband and Adoniram Judson and his wife Sarah Judson, were the first missionaries in the world missions movement from the United States. They were sent out by the Presbyterians and Congregationalists to propagate the gospel, and they were going to Burma. When they arrived there, the Judsons switched over and became Baptist, but the Newells would have continued to fulfill their mission to propagate the gospel. However, Harriet Newell died on the way there. She died on the island of Paris. And so her account is a very fascinating account because it has to do with her call to missions, her call to marry her husband, and then the account of her travels across and the early accounts of them um, being with missionaries in India. So hers is a very fascinating story. Also, there is the Mexican War Diary and Correspondence of George B. McClellan. The Mexican-American War is an understudied area, and so I thought this would have been a great resource for us to look at. What's fascinating about George McClellan is, if you recall from Civil War history, many of the generals cut their teeth on battle tactics and really learning and to understand Napoleonic warfare through the Mexican-American War. And George McClellan was the head of the Union Army at the very beginning of the Civil War. So it's very fascinating reading this particular work because it gives you more context for the Mexican-American War and who he is as a military figure. Then, of course, we also have narrative accounts of Harriet Jacobs and the other narrative account of Frederick Douglass. Now, just remember these last ones that I'm showing you, Franklin, McClellan, Jacobs, and Douglass, and Harriet Newell, they're part of the suggested texts. They are texts that you can do research on for your research paper, but they're not required for you to do as reading for the course. But for all of these readings, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs are extremely important accounts from the standpoint of a slave, one being a female, the other being a male, and these two works were significant for creating and facilitating the abolition movement in America leading up to the Civil War. So these are very significant pieces of history. Frederick Douglass's account particularly creates a dilemma because he creates an argument that says you can't be both a spiritual converted Christian and a slave master. And so one of the things that readers have to wrestle with is the issue of spirituality and being a slave owner and the ethical dilemma that that presents. Anyway, these are our suggested and our required texts. Next, what we'll do is in the next video, we will look at our schedule and I'll map out what our week will look like and how our assignment schedule will shape up. Thank you.